Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Procurement. And this week we resume the regularly scheduled programming following doing something a little bit different last week due to the Thanksgiving break in the US. Now, when you hear today's interview, I think you'll understand why I waited for another week to post it. The guest is Kelly Barner. Now, Kelly is very well known in the procurement industry, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on Kelly's background as we start the interview. We really touched on a wide range of topics in this interview. Originally, my intent was to talk about supply market intelligence, and we did talk about that, but we also talked a lot about the future of procurement. And what was really interesting specifically to me was our discussions around robotics process automation and the role that RPA can play in the evolution and in the development of the procurement function and the procurement value proposition. So thanks again for downloading the show today and listening to the episode. Let's go straight into the interview. So welcome to another episode of The Art of Procurement. So today's guest, I'm delighted to join me with Kelly Barner. So Kelly is the owner and the editor of Buyer's Meeting Point, which is an online resource for procurement and purchasing professionals. So Kelly is obviously very well known in the procurement community, and she was recognized 2012, 13, 14 and 15 as a Procurement Pro to Know by Supply and Demand Chain Executive magazine. So Kelly is also a published author and has co-authored Supply Market Intelligence for Procurement Professionals in 2014, and also co-authored Procurement at a Crossroads, Career Impacting Insights into a Rapidly Changing Industry. And that's going to be published later next month in December 2015. So Kelly, welcome to the Art of Procurement.
Thank you, Phil. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I'm delighted you were able to join us today. So Kelly, you have deep expertise in procurement, but that's not where you started. You studied English and history in college. So how did you go from majoring in pre-1700s English literature to a career in procurement?
I know, it's really funny. I always say to people that I am proof that you can study Shakespearean literature in college and yet still make a living someday. So I think I represent hope for a lot of college students. So my original plan was to be a professor of literature, and my path took a couple of funny twists. I actually ended up leaving undergrad and going directly into a graduate program for library and information science with the idea that I would work in a corporate library, which I did for a little over a year. I actually worked as part of the knowledge management program at a Dutch-based company called Royal Ahold, which has an Ahold USA operating unit based here in the U.S. It's a chain of supermarket, retail, and e-grocery delivery services and food service. And let me think the timeline. Just shortly after, it was 2001, 2002, Ahold, unfortunately, had sort of an Enron-style accounting mishap, and the company had some troubles, and so they immediately started axing every function which wasn't operationally critical. And go figure, knowledge management fell into the not operationally critical bucket. But to my good fortune, I had started a company-sponsored MBA program. And so when they realized, as they were either realigning or laying off some of my other colleagues, if they let me go, they were letting me walk away with half of a very expensive MBA. And so they came to me and said, how do you feel about strategic sourcing? And I was 23, and so I said, I love it. Will you pay me to do it? And I went straight to my computer and started Googling to figure out what on earth strategic sourcing was. But I love it. It was a great fit. And I have never looked back.
It's funny that seems to be kind of the origin story for so many people in procurement, that it's not necessarily something you grew up thinking, that's what I want to do as my career. but you find it. And
yeah, it's kind of a toss-up. Do I want to be a ninja or a procurement analyst?
Right.
It's kind of a tough choice when you're young.
I know, but then when you get into it and you think, actually, this is pretty cool. I get to see so much of the business and get maybe a higher level view of an entire organization than I would in another area. And, you start doing well and it kind of sticks. And I know that's what happened in my career for sure.
No, it is. And it's actually interesting that even after I landed within procurement, my uncertain journey sort of continued. So my first bit of time in procurement was being on the team that was tasked with selecting and implementing a strategic sourcing solution. So there wasn't really anything in-house. They did have spend analysis, but we were coming up with the RFP and then vetting the different solutions that were available at the time. Then we selected and rolled it out. From there, once the implementation was done, I actually went over and worked. It was a category-driven team. So I was assigned to hired services, which was another stroke of good luck. I actually didn't source anything that was a product until years after I had entered sourcing. So I've never been sort of constrained by the mindset that some people have that services are somehow different and therefore hard. And after I finished my MBA program, there actually wasn't a ton of opportunity at the time internally. And so at that point, I switched sides. Some people would say I went to the dark side. And I worked as the Associate Director of Consulting Services at Emtura for a few years before they were acquired by IBM. So first I did it from the user side. Then I worked at a solution provider for a number of years. And now I'm getting to look at the industry from a third perspective, which is sort of the news and media and thought leadership side.
And it's actually interesting that you have experience on both sides of the table. I think that if people have the opportunity to do that, it's really valuable because it gives you more of a kind of overall perspective on the value that procurement can deliver, but also in kind of selling the value proposition of procurement. It's something you do a little bit when you're on the corporate side, but when you go into the service provider side, that's really a huge part of your role. And it makes you think differently about what the value proposition is because you've got to sell that so aggressively to be successful.
That's absolutely true.
And so when you, so now you are the owner and editor of Buyers Meeting Point. So could you just give a little bit of an overview of what that is?
Sure. So I think the best description I've actually heard anybody else offer up of Buyers Meeting Point is that we serve as a filter. So the site was originally started with the idea that education or professional development is incredibly important to procurement and to some extent should be procurement specific for people in the field. Mm-hmm. But that there are so many resources out there that second objective, somebody needs to pull those all together and evaluate them for being current enough and relevant and high enough quality so that when someone who is in the trenches doing the work realizes that they need a resource, they have a place where they can go and connect with the information that they have. And as our collection of information, which spans books and blogs and events and news and information about solution providers, whether on their own sites or social media. As that grew, we realized that we couldn't just list it all. We had to provide some kind of insight or information about it so that people knew they weren't so overwhelmed by all of the information that there was. And that's really what led us to add the blog. We do a blog talk radio program. We take the opportunity to not just review the new books that are coming out, but speak to the authors and hear the backstory and maybe some of the operational details that didn't make it into the book. So Buyers Meeting Point, both through our website as well as through Blog Talk radio station, BMP Radio, and our LinkedIn group, as well as a very active Twitter account. We sort of pull in as much information as we can, digest it, actually consume. We attend the events. We read the books. So we're not just making recommendations based on sort of press release or cover type content we're given. We go through it ourselves. And then we can make recommendations as objectively as humanly possible so that people know they can trust that if we say something is worth attending or worth reading or putting time into, that they are in fact going to come away with value.
Yeah, and I think that Buyer's Meeting Point, I think it's a fantastic resource for procurement and purchasing professionals. I think that something you touched on there was around the curation of content. Today, more than ever, there seems to be just an explosion of content. You can go on Twitter and go to a procurement hashtag, for example, and there's article after article after article. And you go and look into that, and some of it's good and some of it's, for the want of a better word, filler. And it's really hard for you to actually be able to know what's valuable content and what's not so valuable. And you can get lost in that. So I think what you do is a really valuable resource for the community. And so more recently, Kelly, you've taken a turn at being a co-author and written a couple of books. One of them is actually going to be published, I think, in the next month or so. And that's looking at the future of procurement. So you talk at least in the summary of the book, that you'll be exploring the future of procurement, the ripple effect that's going to have across our community. And you mentioned that an impressive future awaits if we as a community make bold choices. So can you give me a brief insight into what you think the future looks like?
Sure. So I think the future of procurement, and ironically, we really did start with the idea that this would be a book about the future. Mm-hmm. And as we dug into the details of what that really meant, we figured out that the reason there is so much discussion about the future is because the present moment is so interesting. There are so many changes, and so it's really about looking for the seeds of tomorrow's potential in the shifts and trends that we're seeing today. And I think that certainly there are going to be some things that affect procurement that are affecting everybody. One of them is just plain generational. The baby boomer generation is leaving the workforce at the same time that millennials are coming in. Those two generations are very different. They have different expectations, and they bring very different strengths to the table. Yeah. So some of that is going to be, we are going to change in similar ways to other functions and professions as those shifts happen. But then other things are new rising capabilities and changes within the technical portion of procurement. And one of the things that I'm keeping a particularly close eye on, that's actually one of the nice things about this job, is that I can be very selfish. Right. If something is interesting to me, I can follow it. Yeah. But is this idea of robotic process automation. Mm-hmm. And for anybody that's not familiar with it, actually robots, don't panic. This isn't like an actual Terminator Rise of the Robots. These are software robots, and they are specifically designed to automate processes. It doesn't even have to be overly tactical, but it does need to be a process that follows rules and has logic gates that go with it so that you can train the machines. And these machines can learn over time. They can be trained to sort of oversimplify it, put in a pile the exceptions that they find when they're going through and doing their process. They can be trained and learn over time if you tell them this exception gets dealt with like this or that exception gets dealt with like that. They can also govern each other. And so you can have robots providing oversight or reporting or analytics into other robots. And I think that this is likely to affect procurement in two ways. One is that we are increasingly going to be running sourcing projects or managing supplier relationships around other parts of the organization making use of RPA. It is a fraction of the cost. Mm-hmm. It is, in a way, outsourcing without outsourcing. Right. And it's very consistent. It can be 24 hours a day. It's not limited by human limitations. So that's the one way that it's going to affect us. And the other way that I think it's going to affect us is that we are going to become consumers of robotic process automation. There are a lot of things within the world of procurement that are very good candidates for automation. Not everything. Again, a second, do not panic. You're not going to be replaced by a robot. But I feel procurement has struggled for years with this idea that some of our work is tactical. Yeah. And I think there's been too much negativity towards that because tactics are incredibly important. Strategy may be high-minded and sort of regarded as prestigious, but it doesn't generate results without tactics. And so you do have to have both. But some of our work that is tactical and can be automated, if we can make use of something like RPA, we can automate those processes while avoiding the fear of dealing with, oh, we've outsourced part of our work, and so the rest of the organization should consider outsourcing the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly there always needs to be some people in-house. But I think it's going to be an amazing thing that's going to give us opportunity. So the combination of generational shifts, things going on with automation, and then the fact that the technology procurement has leveraged for so long in going through the SaaS delivery model, availability in the cloud, more and more technology is becoming acceptable. You no longer have these divides between, oh, well, why would I work with this tiny little new vendor? That's too risky. I must work with this very large established vendor. Not really the case anymore. It's leveled the playing field in a lot of ways, which opens the door to innovation because you have these new companies that haven't been around as long, but may have fantastic ideas or may not be saddled with the baggage of their past or had to migrate solutions from one model to the next. And so I think we're also going through an amazing time of evolution on that front. And all of these things are converging that if we can be ready and enthusiastic and roll with the changes, the opportunities are huge.
That's really kind of very interesting on the RPR side, particularly because I hear more and more about robotics process automation. And it's turning from something that was very conceptual into something that I think is becoming real.
Yes.
How mature do you think it is? Is it something that there are service providers out there who are able to help you lever RPA today, or is it something that maybe 12, 24, or even 5 years out into the future?
Oh, there's no question. There are companies out there today that are providing these solutions, and they're effectively software design companies. You don't tend to hear software discussed anymore as much. We talk about apps and solutions, but they are effectively writing a program that's on some kind of pre-existing platform but does the task that you need with the output you need and follows the rules that you establish. I think where we are is that the companies that are leading edge enough to consider RPA as a solution know how leading edge they are, and most of them are kind of at the make versus buy decision stage. I think in a lot of cases they feel that they are so leading edge with this that what they really need to do is either hire people in-house to do it or have very unique consulting arrangement type deals with providers that have the capability. It's not quite turnkey yet, although there are dedicated firms out there to designing these programs. And so it's interesting. It's the cycle of things. It's very much like the early days of e-sourcing,
right,
where, oh my goodness, if we want to establish a sourcing process, obviously we need to bring in A.T. Kearney or Accenture. How could we possibly? They're going to design us a process. And today you look back on that and you think, it was just 6 lists of bullets on a piece of paper. Like we could have figured that out. But at the time, it's so leading that companies going down that path do have the tendency to make the extra investment to handle it right. So I think 5 years from now, I think it's going to be far more turnkey. I think it's going to be far more common. We're in early stages, but I think that the rate of adoption of things like RPA is picking up in speed. So it's not going to be a 10, 15-year horizon,
right,
unless, of course, something else better swoops in the meantime and displaces it. I would think 5 years from now it's going to be fairly common and accepted.
Interesting. What's interesting to me on the provider side is that it's for service providers who are in the procurement outsourcing space that would be impacted by this, it's kind of cannibalizing their own business offering to start switching to things like RPA because it's so, you just don't need the intensive labor that you do in some of the other solutions that are out there. So it'd be really fascinating to see how the market evolves to, the companies who focus on being an expert in RPA and kind of shift their business model to those who really want to keep hold of what they've got. And they're the ones that are at risk of getting left behind in this kind of switch from labor-heavy, offshore, labor arbitrage type solutions to being able to lever RPA.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting, and this is where the timing comes into play with a lot of this, is that even just within the procurement solution space, integration today is really the name of the game. And it's not even just about, my e-sourcing solution or my P2P solution can integrate with my ERP that I've had in place for a long time. It's about allowing companies to get to an end-to-end, whether you call it source to pay or procure to pay solution that picks and chooses from different solutions. And I can remember looking back at my time at Taurus, in conversations with a client or a prospective client, you would never say the name of another company.
Right.
That was tantamount to free advertising. But today, you can go to someone's site and they will say, here are all the things we do, here's our functionality, here's our full suite. Oh, and by the way, we integrate with this one and that one and the other one. We've done this. And they are companies that are competitive with each other because they have module overlap or capability overlap if they're not using a module type structure. And I think that also opens the door to being able to say, if you'd like to take advantage of some of this automation capability that's now available, well, we integrate with a competitor. Why not also integrate with some of these automation type things? And so I just think the mindset is right and the timing is right. And a lot of that is what's contributing to right now being such an interesting time in the field.
Yeah, and that integration, I think, then enables more of a focus for companies to be the expert in one particular technology solution, because there's going to be more integration anyway. I think there's less importance on end-to-end solutions, because for a lot of companies, no longer do you just need one company to do from A to Z across the entire technology suite. Get experts who do one thing very well and then build that all together. And it means that the service provider landscape will look a lot different.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
So moving into supply market intelligence. So I could talk about the future of procurement and RPA for a long time. But I know that, the primary reason really I wanted to talk to you on the show was about supply market intelligence. What is it? How can you find it? How do you use it? So I know you've co-authored a book on supply market intelligence, and I'm going to link to that in the show notes. How do you define supply market intelligence?
So we actually have a very carefully crafted definition of supply market intelligence in the book. And I always say to people when we talk about it, this is the short definition. You have to trust me on that. But the super Reader's Digest version is that the idea of SMI is that you are going out and finding information. So you're going out, you're getting facts, you're bringing it in, and you're analyzing it and refining it so that you can form recommendations to inform actions. So we make a couple of different distinctions in the book. The first is between information and intelligence, right? So information is just simply, it's a fact, it's some piece of data, it is what it is. It's not applied, it's not specific, and it's not actionable. But intelligence is taking that and looking at your company or at the market that you play in or in the suppliers that you partner with and saying, knowing this and also knowing what our plans are or our objectives or our priorities, it tells us that we should do the following or it tells us we should not do the following. And that's where you've really taken info, put it to a process, and turned it into intelligence, which to most companies is worth its weight in gold.
Right. And do you find that most companies invest in that kind of intelligence, or are they investing in some data, maybe on an as-needed basis, rather than actually looking at a little bit more holistically at accessing the data and then turning that into the intelligence that they need?
It's definitely category specific. In a lot of cases, the information that you would pay for, I think the best example of this is Platts data. So their daily fuel prices per station, per type of fuel.
Yeah. That's
something that if you're in logistics, if you operate a fleet, that's something you're paying for that information and you're having it come in-house. But most companies, especially for the majority of the spend that procurement is dealing with, there is not a class alternative, and there's also not the appetite on the part of the organization to invest in it. So even very generalist services like a Dun & Bradstreet subscription or access to the news portion of LexisNexis, so many people see that as, well, I'm not a lawyer, I don't need to pull up case history.
Right.
But the Nexus portion, the news in LexisNexis is amazing. But these subscriptions cost a lot of money. And so many procurement organizations either don't have access to them or do not have the people that have been professionally trained to get the value out of them, even if they were willing to fork over the money for the subscriptions. And so basically what we've said in the book is that, no, are we suggesting that you can read this book and then, go head up research at an analyst firm?
Right.
No, that's not really the thing. Mm-hmm. But what we're saying is with a little bit of process discipline and a master plan and a sense for how to vet information, you can be a heck of a lot further ahead than you are right now with really no investment other than your own time and effort. And the idea is that it should be enabling because there is no question that procurement and the decisions that they make and recommend are affected by external factors. And it's really about ensuring that those external factors are discovered and brought to bear wherever they can improve the decisions that the organization makes.
And so why don't you think that a lot of companies understand the ROI for investing in supply market intelligence?
If I had to guess, I would say that it's because so many procurement teams have started by managing a very narrow, low-value potential portion of the spend. Mm-hmm. Office supplies is sort of the classic example. And if you're going to start with that kind of spend, over time, obviously the goal within procurement is to $1 at a time conquer the universe in terms of what we're managing. But I think it comes with it this idea that why would you need those expensive things? I think if you were to design a procurement team from scratch today and set their objectives as being strategic and value-oriented and having both top and bottom line impact, there would be no question. Of course you need access to some kind of information or services in order to do what we're asking you to do.
Right.
But things have a way of just changing over time, and I think it's hard for organizations to change their perception of not only what procurement is and who they are and what they're capable of, but also what they need in order to deliver what the organization is looking for. And fortunately, it's another benefit of timing. We're in a place today where there is kind of an expectation that most information will be available for free on the internet.
Right.
Certainly, you can still pay thousands of dollars for analyst reports, or you can sign up for an expensive service, but an awful lot of information is available. The difference is you have to substitute your own effort for the filtering that goes into something like a Dun & Bradstreet, like a LexisNexis, because you have to look into, most obviously, the date. Is it current enough? But who wrote it? Why did they write it? Were they well informed? Did they do their homework? The good news is somebody has to do that work if the organization is going to benefit and have access to the intelligence. And the case that we're making is that procurement is positioned perfectly to be that team. And by simply starting to do the work, it's a way of seizing an opportunity and improving not only what they're capable of, but also how we are perceived by the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful in being able to show actual intelligence around what you're buying, around the categories, the products or services, rather than letting the market define the information that they share with you, which is essentially what happens when you don't have access to supply market intelligence. You're trusting the market to tell you what you think you need to know, whereas it's really what they want you to know.
Absolutely. And it is also, it may be external information, but it has a huge internal impact. Because in most cases, if you're working a high-value potential project, you're working with a series of very well-informed, dedicated stakeholders. And there is nothing worse than being in a meeting with them in the course of a supplier management meeting or a sourcing project, and they mention some index or some association or some trend, and you know you're giving them a blank stare. That is the worst, and you just know that their respect for you is dwindling in that moment. And so it's also about making sure that procurement is informed enough to be a good team member to internal stakeholders and to be able to stand on equal footing with suppliers who obviously know the market when that time comes.
Yeah, and actually that's an important point and really key in how your stakeholders perceive you, because especially on the indirect side where there isn't truly a mandate for procurement use, there may be a process, but we know it's a lot harder to actually get engagement on the indirect side than is on the direct side. Your ability to do that really reflects on you how you can build relationships with the stakeholders and that they think that they're dealing with a peer. The moment that you kind of show to them that you don't really understand their business and the pricing factors or the intelligence that they're thinking of when they're wondering about how best to lever a supply base to achieve what they want to achieve, then it shows that you're really there to help with a transaction, not to help drive a strategic agenda.
And it keeps I don't like the idea of power balance, but it's sort of the best dynamic idea I can come up with to describe it. You do, in fact, even if people have different roles and responsibilities, you do want everyone on a cross-functional team to be equal, because otherwise the perspective or the function that you represent is underrepresented on that team. And so being able to stand toe-to-toe, and no, you should not be informed on everything. The idea is not to say to them, oh, I could have done this on my own because I did all this reading. There should absolutely be times in that kind of a conversation where you say, you know what, I want to back up. You said something. I need to go learn more about it. Can you give me that information again, or tell me where to go to learn more about that? That is perfectly acceptable, but you need to demonstrate that you've made the effort up front to make every single meeting as productive as it can be.
In a past interview on the Art of Procurement, I spoke with an executive sales leader and sales coach, and asked what the trigger points were that sales representatives looked for in procurement people to understand whether they're an enabler and whether they can help drive a strategy, and whether they're really closely aligned with the business or whether they're just there to place a purchase order. And that was one of the signs they looked for, is their understanding of A, what you want out of the product or service that you're buying as a company, but B, how well do you understand the marketplace? Because if you don't understand the marketplace, then they'll just go around you, which makes it really hard for you then to control the strategy that you're trying to put in place with your stakeholder. If the suppliers know that you don't understand the marketplace like they do.
No, that's absolutely true. And let's face it, collaboration notwithstanding, relationship building notwithstanding, if a salesperson sees an opportunity and knows that you are the only roadblock between them and it, hold on to your hat, because they are going to pass you at such a speed. And so it is about being prepared to serve that role, both for the project that you're on, as well as for the potential opportunities down the road.
And so do you recommend in the book a framework for how you would essentially go and acquire the supply market intelligence that you need, and how you go and collect it, and maybe where you should look? Or do you have any guidance or tips to a professional who needs to do it for a particular area of spend or a category and they don't really know where to start?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing I will say, plug for the book, my co-author Jeanette Jones is amazing with research. So if I'm predominantly procurement with some library science in my background, she is a rock star library scientist, corporate researcher that has spent most of her time supporting procurement. So the second half of the book is all the resources that you would need, the places to go, the kind of information they offer, whether they're free or whether they require an investment. And she does it both generally as well as by category or industry. So I will not even attempt to go into the details of that. Right. Super kudos to Jeanette. She really nailed that part of the book. In terms of the process, one of the things we talk about at the very beginning is sort of, especially if you haven't done a ton of it, the paralyzing fear of a blank page. So if you don't know a lot, how on earth do you get started? And one of the suggestions that I've made is that, first of all, it's just about getting started. So the initial part of the process, we call it research, read, and refine, is iterative. You're going to go through it a number of times. But it starts, most specifically, with a quick and dirty search. And so I actually advocate going super old school. Get yourself a piece of paper and these nifty little things they have called pens. And don't attempt to type. Don't attempt to get all fancy. Just write down either the few things that you know or the few things that you don't know. They might be supplier names. They might be industry descriptions. It could be a product or service. And just literally go get yourself some information and take notes as you go. So what you're going to do is, most people use Google. It's fantastic. I always say if you're going to do one thing to improve your research capabilities, it's to start going to Google's advanced search page. That has built into it a lot of the logic, phrases, which site do you want to search? Do you want to put limitations on this in terms of the type of results we return or the dates of the content? So it'll help you start to think like a professionally trained researcher. And it's just about you research, you read the information, and you refine your search strategy. So each time you go around that loop, you're coming back to the research position better informed with more specific things that you're looking for. The only thing to be cautious of is please do not put yourself in the position of having to go relocate something that you read in the first or second round and didn't realize was relevant. So the other sort of pragmatic thing we recommend is have a blank email open or a blank Word document. You find an article that's remotely interesting, copy and paste the link, and make a note to yourself about why it was important, because you will end up going back and nobody has extra time to relocate things. So we go from research, read, and refine to the point, you basically hit the point of diminishing returns. And at that point, you're going to stop and put together your information in some kind of we call it an executive brief, but it's a document that captures the key information that you found, how it pertains to the project or how it affects the organization. And you would think that the next step would be to distribute that brief, but it is not. We actually have an internal review hurdle where, depending on the category or the people involved, at that point you stop and you either pull together a group of procurement colleagues and you sit down and let them read it and make the case and field their questions, or in really important cases, it needs to go before the CPO, and there almost has to be like a thesis defense, because as stressful and difficult as that could be for the person doing the research, better to air the laundry within procurement than to have already pulled in stakeholders before you find that there's either an incorrect assumption or an obviously missing piece of information. A lot of times, even putting it in front of somebody that hasn't been involved in the project, with a procurement mindset, they're going to read the information and ask the obvious question. And the internal approval hurdle is really about catching that obvious question and making sure that there's going to be a first question asked in the meeting with stakeholders, but you want it to be a little further down the road than the obvious one. And then, of course, the final step is to share it with the team. And, of course, we're saying, very realistically, it's called brief for a reason. It should not be a scroll that bounces down along the room. It needs to be very factually oriented, just right up top, bullets with data, numbers, and then some very brief recommendations. If you've had to go more than halfway down the back of that page, you probably need to refine it, because executives don't flip papers over, right? If you haven't really caught them by the end of that first page, there's no way they're going to get to the valuable stuff on the back. And the other thing that we talk about, and I think this is an idea that actually people have trouble with if they haven't been schooled in research, is that your job is not to know things that no one else knows. Your job is to have found things that nobody else could find. And so don't expect to sit down and say, I can now spout all of these numbers. You know what? Nobody wants your numbers. They want numbers from the associations and the analysts and the professionals that have the background and the training to provide them with authority. And so, again, you don't have to be compliant with some sort of collegiate strategy, but you do need to cite your sources, even as footnotes or endnotes in the brief, because where those numbers came from, don't feel bad they're not yours. Like I said, nobody wants yours. But saying, I found this from the such and such association, or I found this in such a paper, or this person, and people also forget to think of humans as a resource. I found this guy on LinkedIn. I read a great article by him. I sent him a message, and we hopped on the phone for 20 minutes. And here's his background. Mm-hmm. All of that adds value to what you've put on the paper, and so therefore adds value to you as a contributing member of the team.
Interesting. And I guess the real value then comes from, and you kind of mentioned it before, taking data and making intelligence, is then interpreting that data so that it's something that gives a perspective that the people who you're presenting it to may not have thought of themselves or may not have been aware of, or understanding of kind of how the data fits together to paint a different picture than what it looks like just on a piece of paper.
Well, and I've written it for a general audience. And if you're within a company, that company has plans in place or holds a very specific position within the market, it's about taking information that was made generally available and saying, based on our timing and our challenges and what we're attempting to accomplish, it should inform us to do this. And one of the other pieces I think I had mentioned earlier in the conversation is that because procurement is so often assessed on savings results or spend under management numbers, we find it very difficult to see value when an action is not taken. But preventing the company from not taking a bad step is in many cases more important than informing them to take a good one. Because a lot of times, these things are not shocks. People do already have information. In most cases, reasonably well-informed people are going to make a decent decision. But if you can stop a bad decision from being made because you provide some sort of information, even if you cause people to pause and rethink, that's a huge impact to have had. And it's something that procurement needs to think about as a positive impact just as much as a hard result.
No, I love that. So the impact of a bad decision, the financial impact, the organizational impact is so much bigger than, as you said, helping people take a good decision a little bit better. We help people make incrementally better decisions. Has a lot less impact than stopping them making a bad decision.
Absolutely. And even if they end up making a bad decision, we actually have a section near the end of the book, what to do when things go wrong. Because let's face it, right, things are going to go wrong. And at least if people were informed, steps were taken and information, bad decisions are going to be made, but if they were made based upon what was the best information available at the time, then at least you can't say someone was completely asleep on the job.
And so that looks at accessing or gathering supply market intelligence for a specific project. Something I'm really interested in is how do you institutionalize that? So how do you build a program around it so that it's proactive and the information comes to you so you can act on it rather than you going and looking for information to fit a particular purpose or a particular brief? Are companies doing that? Are they building programs around the gathering of supply market intelligence? And what does that look like? What's the ROI of doing something like that?
Well, I think that there are more attempts now to institutionalize it. I think where we are most often seeing it is on the risk front. So you can bring in a solution that may or may not integrate with your other procurement solutions where you flag suppliers or industries or locations that are important. And so therefore it's being monitored for you in the background on an ongoing basis. More simply speaking, you can establish Google alerts I think more broadly, procurement just needs to be well read. I think information is so much more, or I should say events are so much more connected now than they have been in the past, that something like religiously reading Construction Industry Quarterly, I mean, of course it has value, but you need to be reading general business publications, general news sources, to help make connections and see trends that are rising in areas that you would not expect to affect the spend that you're managing. So that's part of it. I think the area that has been a traditional structure for this is the category playbook. People talk about the category playbook like it's, the Holy Grail. And I think the challenge of them, first of all, no one ever seems to have seen one. And I think it's typically because if you're going to make a decent category playbook, you are going to guard that as jealously as you possibly can. You're not going to share it on a webinar. You're not going to present it at a conference. That's internal information, and it needs to be protected. But I think the bigger thing about it is however you store the information, it needs to be alive and it needs to be connected. So putting together, I can remember days of people putting together category playbooks that were actually books in a binder. And you think about that now in terms of how it would mesh with not only the speed of change and news and information, but also the physical location of the people that need access to that information. Nobody wants a series of dusty binders up on a shelf. You also don't want to save it in a way that requires you to create additional work. And so if you were going to put relevant spend data or supplier information in a binder like that, why not, to use your word about institutionalizing it, make sure that there's either a report or a bookmarked view that's saved within the spend analysis solution so that other people can get to it. They're looking at your same parameters, but they're seeing them refreshed with the most recent transactions and data available. And so I think it's less about designing a way to create a thing, and it's more about making a path that other people can follow and that you can use to justify where you're standing in the moment. It's about wearing something down that people can follow. And then, truthfully, owning it after the decision is made. There does need to be some ownership. I think it's fantastic for the teams that can dedicate someone to research. I mean, you're really sitting pretty, but that's not a reality at a lot of organizations. And so it does become a shared task that people need to step up and contribute to.
Something that stood out to me as you were talking then is how this is an opportunity for robotics process automation. So there's so many data sources out there that you can pull into. Once you've identified the right sources and the right information that you need, you can automate that into, whether it's into a dashboard or whatever it looks like, but you can take a lot of the human element out of it so that you're getting access to the actionable intelligence or data that you need without having to invest a bunch of time. And that seems like it's one of the key benefits of something like RPA may be able to bring.
No, it absolutely does, because not only are you going through the process of saying these are the things that I want to monitor, you're going through the process, which is beneficial in and of itself, of saying, when do I want someone or something to raise their hand and say, you need to take a look at this? And so it's about, if you're watching for disruption or if you're watching about a new player coming into the space, the nice thing about this is that it forces people to start thinking bigger in advance about anticipating events or anticipating changes that could be good or bad, and putting parameters in place that establish their risk or tolerance threshold. But of course, in order to establish those, you need to have had the conversation and figure out what your risk or tolerance threshold is. And even those conversations not only contribute to the procurement being better informed, but as we've been saying along the way, change perception of us and what we're capable of for the better, because it demonstrates a big picture mindset.
And so I'm cognizant of time. We've had a really interesting and full conversation that I feel we could go into a lot more detail actually, but we're touching on the probably 50-minute mark. So what I want to do is just open it up. And if there's anything that I haven't asked that you think is really valuable to the listeners around supply market intelligence and how you can access it and how you can use it to basically create value for your stakeholders and for your company, is there anything that I've missed that you would like to touch on?
I think the only thing that maybe we haven't talked about and that I feel is so important, but it's much like this idea of a net result being a step that wasn't taken, that people kind of struggle with it. I think more time needs to be carved out of procurement's schedule for sort of like intellectual pursuits. Carve out time to read. And this is not about, reading about the Kardashians. This is literally, you are following things that aren't even connected to your category. And that's where, I joke about the Kardashians, but I think there's this stigma about reading news online at work. People are going to question, it's the difference between you could show up 2 hours early every day, but nobody's going to give you the same kind of credit they do if you stay 2 hours late every day, because no one wants to stay late. So getting away from the stigma that reading to be informed is somehow waste of company time or misuse of resources is something we need to get past. And I do think that an easy entry point is getting an online subscription to something that's a minimal cost. You don't have to go all the way LexisNexis. Get a Wall Street Journal subscription that people can share. Or get access to that kind of information, even in print form. If your team happens to be all co-located, make sure that every day the newspapers come in and are spread out on the break room table or the conference room table. There should be an expectation that the group is going to be informed, and that if something interesting is found, even if it's general, that it gets shared. That's absolutely critical as well. And so whether it's saying to people, this article is super fascinating, I want to share it with you all, and circulating it, or calling everybody together for a 30-minute coffee break to talk about a news story. I think making it a collective effort not only improves the results that you get, but it has a way of making sure that it continues to happen. You don't want supply market intelligence to be something that everybody gets behind on day one, and then by day 3, everybody's going, nothing's really different. So, that was just another meeting.
Haven't found anything yet.
Yeah, exactly. I guess we're doing it. I guess we were already so intelligent we didn't need to change anything. It is about getting the ball rolling, but then putting the enthusiasm and the energy behind keeping it rolling so that it becomes not a different initiative along procurement's other responsibilities, but a thread that kind of runs through everything that we do.
Just reading and learning, continuous development. I mean, that's a theme that just runs through all the discussions that I have with people who are high performing, who are in, who have been very successful in their careers. It's something that is really difficult to carve time out to invest in because it seems like it has no immediate return. But compounding over time, it means that you're really able to, you have a much broader perspective on things and able to kind of connect a lot of very disparate dots into something that makes sense because you have a broader understanding of things.
Oh, and God forbid you enjoy it. Oh my gosh, if we get people reading the news and enjoying it, that's definitely a complete misuse of time. It's actually something you want to encourage. If people aren't enjoying reading the news and learning about things, there's actually a whole other problem there.
All right, well, we're coming up to the end of the show, Kelly. So first of all, thank you very much for the time today. It's been a fantastic conversation, very insightful. And as I say, I could have gone on for more. So I'm sure that there may be people who would like to contact you to reach out to discuss some of the points in more detail. If they do, where can they find you?
So I'm very easy to find. You can visit buyersmeetingpoint.com, and there's a Contact Us page. You can look for me on Twitter. You can look for me either personally on LinkedIn or my group on LinkedIn and ask to join. I'm very happy to hear from anybody that wants to reach out. And I appreciate you having me today, Phil. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. And I'm going to link to your contact details and a summary of the show today with any links to relevant content. I'm going to put them all in some show notes. And those will be at artofprocurement.com/SMI. So that's artofprocurement.com/SMI. So, Kelly, thank you very much again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Phil. You as well.